So, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Construction Schedules Explained, What to Expect at Every Stage. My name is Michelle, and I'm an executive assistant at TQ Construction. I will be helping behind the scenes today. So as mentioned, a few things to note here quickly. The session is being recorded, and a link will be shared in an email in the next couple of days. Please, everyone, stay muted throughout the webinar to avoid any disruptions. We do have a Q&A at the end, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat box below, and Megan and Henry will be able to answer them at the Q&A at the end. Now I'm pleased to introduce to you Project Relations Megan and our special guest, TQ Construction's President Henry.
Thanks, Michelle. Welcome everybody. Glad to have you all here. I'm leaning heavily on Megan to kind of keep me on task. As a heads up, I do get a little chatty, and that's why I asked Megan to kind of do most of these. She's a little more disciplined than I am on these things. But I do have a pretty broad view on kind of a construction schedule and projects. I'm a certified builder or licensed builder operating TQ Construction for a number of years, and we've taken on a wide range of projects, and so we're kind of looking forward to sharing some of our experience today.
Yeah, and I'm always excited to take on these webinars and present them with people. I love the engagement, especially at the end with all the questions that we get, and bringing the topics to everyone is it's been a journey. This is the last topic that we've come up with, not to be new ones in the future, but it's been quite the journey putting together these 10 webinars that we've put together over the last year. So to just jump right on into it, I'd like to just kind of apologize preemptively. I'm going to try to avoid I'm just getting over a cold, but if I run into a coughing fit, I am so sorry. But running into our table of contents for today. So we're going to be going through just like a construction schedule for, in this case, we're going to talk about like all the things that you could potentially expect in a new home. And then, conversationally, we can talk about, what that would mean for projects of different sizes. And if people have specific questions for specific size projects at the end, like Michelle said, please feel free to throw those questions in. But we're going to be running through everything kind of from beginning to end of construction itself. So you've received your permit and you're good to go. You're good to fly off into the sunset. So every construction project starts with some kind of like demolition and site prep. We're going to go through groundwork and concrete work, framing and services, and what's kind of all included in that. Weatherproofing, which is, making sure that no water, no weather gets into the building, and that if it does get into the building, it has a place to drain out of. Rough insulation, so getting all of your like plumbing lines in place and all of your electrical lines in place and getting everything insulated so that your home is nice and the correct temperature that you want it to be. Cool in the summer, warm in the winter. Then it's a race to the finish. It's a on painting, interior finishes, and exterior finishes, the final touches of exterior finishes. So before we really dive in, there's another picture kind of near the end as well that kind of helps to bring this home. Is I don't actually normally bring a lot of attention to the pictures in the background, but in this particular one, it shows a snapshot of a construction schedule. So just kind of keeping in mind that some things do like overlap and occur congruently or at the same time. So just kind of keeping that in mind as we go. So diving into demolition and site prep. Obviously, we want to make sure that every site that we set up is safe and it's got all the appropriate fencing and signage, and every municipality has slightly different requirements for that. Mm-hmm. And then going through and making sure that all the hazardous materials are properly remediated. Everything that's clean demo that doesn't have any hazardous materials are removed. You want to make sure that all of your services are disconnected and you have all your temporary services put in. And the theme of all of these slides as we come through, not theme necessarily, but the last point is inspections. You'll see that it's mentioned on every single slide,
Yeah.
um, because we have to do them everywhere.
Yeah, and on this slide, there's probably about 3 or 4 different inspections that you could expect to take place. And if it's okay, I'll use the city of Vancouver as an example because it seems to be where most of our building happens in the region in terms of density. But the process is fairly similar, essentially across the Lower Mainland. But to kind of like make it start off with site safety, that usually involves making sure there's fencing around, but that's often for insurance purposes. But we have to put up our tree protection, make sure that there's a safe plan for the demolition, and that has to be approved by the city. And then mentioned hazmat, and so we have to do our salvage and abatement, which again has its own round of inspections, which is usually covered by a qualified professional. So usually engage somebody to do a follow-up set of testing on the home as part of the remediation, and then you're allowed to do your clean demolition, get your demo permit. But before you do that, you usually need to have you want to have your electrical and gas disconnected for when you're ready to knock over the house. And then connect your temporary services because when we're building, we do need to have some power and water to the site. Uh, and this process, depending on the jurisdiction and the steps of approvals, can be as quick as 5 or 6 days of time spent between the hazmat and the demolition and the disconnection. But what's more likely is it for it to span at least a few weeks, both in terms of setting up the site safety, tree protection, and then going through the process of hazmat if it's necessary, and then following again with the clean demo and all the extra stops and starts that are required for both civic and like kind of work safe compliance.
And it's not just the municipality either, is it, Henry? Because I know that like we've been putting in requests for like disconnections with like Fortis and BC
Mhm.
Hydro, and like they all have their own timelines too that we have to juggle into the mix.
That's right. It's like typically you want to get Fortis, contacting Fortis and Hydro for your service disconnections, like well in advance, when it's time to actually, you'll be knocking over the house or doing your major demolition. Um, and like Fortis is typically 3 to 4 weeks out, and what we would expect from the first phone call. Hydro is sometimes a little bit faster, but sometimes we're a little bit slower. It kind of depends on their own workload.
And then once everything's kind of like demoed and ready to go, then it's really about getting that hole in the ground that
Yeah,
everybody talks about that hole in the ground, but there's that pre-step before the hole in the ground where you have to get ready to dig it.
that's right.
Um,
That's right.
yeah. So then we move into, our excavation and shoring. We have to do a survey for the new house. So we have to get a survey as a part of our planning process, but we also need a survey to show where the house is actually going to sit on the property once everything is kind of taken away. And then it's really about getting everything set up to, get the concrete poured. So getting all of the forming, the rebar,
Hmm.
getting like services pre-run at that initial stage, making sure that everything's going to come to the forming in the right place.
Totally.
And then also making sure that everything's hooked up to the municipality for, water, storm, sewer, drainage, all that fun stuff.
Yeah. And so in kind of the groundwork and concrete phase, in new construction is where we'll find the most surprises. Uh, if we're doing like a major renovation or restoration project, then you typically will find that in the initial demolition naturally because you're dealing with an existing building. But here, like the first line here mentions excavation and shoring, and the image here is actually of a house that's currently under construction, much further along now than it is in this picture. But what I'll point out to everybody is kind of how deep this foundation is. Part of it is because the back half of the house has a like extra deep basement. There's like a 12-foot ceiling in there. But then to do that, we needed to have some fairly serious shoring along the property line to make sure that our neighbors' houses stayed upright and not into our excavation hole. And so that was something that had to be certified and designed by a geotechnical engineer. And then like they supervise the installation and confirm it's done correctly. And that's usually done by our excavation contractor.
And the different new homes that we've done, what usually like, because there's obviously like different property types. So what are the kind of
Yeah.
the things that make this stage more complicated?
Sure. And so I mean, like I just touched on one, which is the depth of the excavation. Like if you're keeping it fairly shallow, like within like 4 feet or so, like what you think of as like a traditional basement in a house, you aren't usually going to need any like excessive shoring unless there's some very soft soil conditions or your home is in the peat bog area. But those are fewer and farther between. And you can also find that information like through public data data sets. Uh, the other version will be the condition of the soil. So some properties you just have really soft ground, and then you have to keep digging until your geotechnical engineer says this ground is sturdy enough for us to put a house on. Or you have to then redesign a kind of specialty foundation to kind of like either pile down to extreme depth to kind of get that bearing, or do some more advanced construction techniques to kind of spread that load of the house out across the property. But
Like,
that, go on.
and I was gonna say, and kind of going back to like more like traditional like basement of like that 4 feet zone.
Mhm.
Where do we typically see the timeline for this kind of work going?
The excavation itself on like a traditional home would probably be done within a couple days, if that. Kind of getting the space graded, flat, backfill with some gravel, ready for concrete. And then the actual formwork and concrete itself, I would expect again to take another few weeks. If the design is fairly simple, then you might be able to crank that out a little faster, but I wouldn't tell them to expect anything shorter than that. Um, and you also want to be able to account like for some of the other items down here before you can backfill, you want to have all your services in the right place, kind of run from to where your city lines are, plan to into where they're going to enter into the basement. Make sure that you have got your damp proofing and your drainage figured out. Like after your for when your foundations are poured. And if you're lucky, you can connect your hookups to the municipality before long. But it is not uncommon for the municipality to be a little behind on their workload, and sometimes you have to essentially pump out the groundwater off of the property, or you have to kind of like use a temporary water connection and not have the sewer connected until for much further down the line. But that is kind of you're a bit at the mercy of the kind of the municipality itself.
Yeah, I think everyone's kind of seen that where like you see the hoses that are just coming off the property and you're pumping everything in. Yeah. And then once you have your concrete and everything, you really start moving into framing. And I think everyone's kind of seen that around the city. I think everyone has like a really good visual representation of that just from driving around or walking around.
Yeah.
But
It's
it
when the
does
house
kind of
gets house
happen.
shaped.
Yeah, right. It looks like a structure. Um, but it does happen kind of like floor by floor. We've
Yeah.
used like wood frame as an example.
Yeah.
A lot of residential is wood frame, but it would be, your structural that kind of gets established per level, and
Mhm.
then any kind of like steel components that would get usually brought in. Either you're lifting them in or you're craning them in, depending on how big they are and how complicated they are. Yay for seismic requirements.
Yep.
And then your floor system of whatever the floor is above, and then it's kind of like rinse repeat until you get to your roof and the truss package for that entire process and your sheathing and whatnot. And then getting into like making sure that there's like back framing for all of your specialty items and your millwork, and making sure that you're retaining walls and forming and framing on the outside. So again, like once your house is in place, similar to not wanting your next door neighbors to fall into your hole, you want your house to stay on your property in the designated spot.
Important.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you've been on these job sites and you've helped with the framing process, having gone through and gotten your red seal. So what is that kind of, because I know there's that phase where it just kind of like seems to go up really
Hmm.
fast. So what does that kind of look like?
So yeah, the initial like building of the shell of the house, where you kind of like call your exterior walls, your floor system, and the main structural components, most of the time is usually done in a matter of weeks. Um, it depends, like Megan alluded to there, about kind of the structural steel connection. Will sometimes impact that because you may have to bring in, like, build a floor system, deliver steel, install steel, and then build the next level, deliver steel, install steel, and kind of have stops and starts built into it. But when you're designing kind of a more impressive home, you want to have big, clear, open spaces, and like also, like Megan alluded to, there are new seismic and lateral load requirements to resist kind of earthquake and severe windstorms that are coming across Canada to the National Building Code. And that means that we have with the engineering requirements across our buildings is going up. But most of the time for a traditional home, you're looking at like under a month to get essentially the go from a foundation to a roof on. But then following that, there's typically an extended period of time of doing like the detailed framing, like getting ready for your drop ceilings, making sure there's enough support for your cabinets, grab bars, any of your accessories. And that stuff just takes a lot of poking around and doing and thinking by the construction team. And that usually, which I'm kind of jumping ahead of us here, starts to happen a little bit during our trades roughing phase. It kind of happens in parallel, like Megan alluded to. Some of these things will start and then have another phase start after, and they kind of tend to overlap each other. Uh, and without kind of getting into project management schedule nerdy stuff, it's kind of important to keep that in mind that a lot of these things kind of happen in parallel to certain points and then have to hit a defined amount of completion before you can move on to the next phase. Going through this framing stage, there's typically two types of inspections you'll deal with. One is uh, your overall city inspection, but then but before that, you'll usually get your structural engineer and any like envelope consultants that you need to at this stage to kind of provide a sign off so that the city can sign off, approve your framing contract as well.
Yeah, so thank you for touching on that. I wanted to kind of touch on, who does the inspecting. It's not just the municipal, but it's also the structural engineer, or as you alluded to before, like the arborist. Sometimes we have to get our professionals to come and sign off on stuff. And then once, the sticks are up and the roof is on, then we start, weatherproofing and making sure that water stays out of the building because we like our buildings to stay dry. We see the fewest issues that way.
Yeah,
So yeah. So we see this where your roofing starts going on, making sure that it kind of I try to allude that it really depends on what your finished product is. That kind of depends on what the process is that leads to the finishing. So, if you've just got like a torch on finish versus if you're dealing with a shingle roof versus if you're dealing with a metal, like that assembly will look a little bit different. But essentially, like you're still going to have like your sheathing, some sort of waterproofing material, and then putting everything on. And
yeah,
then with your when you get into your openings, your windows, your doors, you're going to see different kinds of waterproofing around those, depending on if it's just like a regular good old window or if it's a 20-foot nana door. And then also just making sure that your building envelope is tight. You've got your sheathing, your rain screening, and then again your exterior cladding.
mm-hmm.
Um, which could also include, we'll talk about insulation in a second here, but because the building code is changing, it could also include outsulation as well, right?
That's right. And this whole section here is definitely one that where a number of items happen in parallel. Like we kind of alluded to previously. So like usually you'll have a lot of your envelope, sheathing, rain screen, and windows in, and your roof on, but you may not have all of your doors, your final doors in at the different times of inspections. And so this is very much one that will happen kind of in an ongoing basis. Like you need to have a certain amount of it completed before you can call different inspections. And a lot of times the exterior detailing and weatherproofing is essentially like it begins sometime in the framing stage and completes sometime after the insulation is complete. And so it's kind of it spans a number of phases. So it's hard to kind of put a defined time frame on it, but it's usually, I would say, over the period of say 6 weeks or so, where you'll see the bulk of the work completed.
And then as you move into like your rough-ins and your insulation, so there's a lot that kind of goes on here, and this is like peak things happen at multiple stages of the project, where we see something start when the framing is all exposed and we see all the electrical lines running through and the plumbing lines running through, similar to the picture that's in the background here, to like all the way through to like actual fixtures and finishes getting like finished installations. And that kind of runs across like plumbing, gas, mechanical, electrical, like all of the different phases where there's just like a ton of stuff going on. So how do we manage that? Because obviously we can't have all of them in at the same time. Leads to
That's
bad
right.
things happening.
Well, there's an order on how we like to have it go. So we always want to have our plumbing start first. And the reason why for that is because plumbing drains specifically have defined slopes that we have to follow. And so we don't want to move, we want to make sure all of our other mechanical lines can work with the plumbing drains. And then usually following that, we'll look at doing our ducting work and kind of planning out where our duct runs are going to go. And then doing our main runs for the electrical. So kind of getting the big pieces planned out. Sprinklers are usually laid out at this time, but not usually installed until a little closer to the completion of the trades work. And all of those things include like plumbing, gas, mechanical, electrical, sprinklers all need to be completed before we can begin our insulation work because insulation is kind of the last part of this phase. Uh, there's actually two inspections, two major phases of inspections that happen here. One is the general trades inspections. So like your plumbing, like I just said, your mechanical, electrical, plumbing, gas, etc. But then you also have uh, once that's approved, then you're allowed to get your framing inspection because you, funny enough, you actually have to complete your rough-ins before you can get your framing passed. And the reason why that is because it's not uncommon for some trades to alter existing framing to kind of get their work done. And so we've all learned that we need to make sure that we look at the framing after the trades are done before moving on to the next phase. And then once we had that, all of those approvals, then we get what's called the OK to cover. So then you install your insulation so you can kind of hide a lot of the work in there, and then you're allowed to drywall following that.
And that kind of covers both of the like what we're talking about with the fire separations as well, like your
That's right.
actual insulation to keep the house warm.
Yeah, so insulation typically is like multiple types. So there's the keeping the warm out, and then there's some of it that is fire rated, or the warm in, I should say, and some of it is fire rated or sound dampening. That kind of gives you a little extra soundproofing that we need to meet requirements between suites and living spaces.
Perfect. And then as we move into drywall and painting, which is, I mean, it's a pretty significant phase.
Mhm.
And I know that a lot of our clients that we work with, they're sometimes kind of like, okay, well, what's going on during this phase? Haven't really seen anybody for a little bit because drywall and paint are both kind of one of those things where like somebody shows up and does something for,
Mhm.
a few days or a few weeks, and then the house is kind of a little bit empty for a little bit.
Yeah, this is the time in a project where we're most likely
Yeah.
to have homeowners both get excited and impatient, because this is a period where the home starts to feel the most like a house. Because like as you can see in here, once you have the white walls, it starts to feel like the inside of your home and not a job site. But on the other hand, drywall itself just takes a while. Like it takes time you have to let it sit after you mud it, and then you have to sand it, then you have to mud it again and let it sit. And you kind of go through this cycle that takes, usually 2 to 3 weeks for a custom home, sometimes a little less for a major renovation. And all the time it doesn't feel like much is happening, but at the same time in this same period is when most of those trades from our previous section send all their invoices in. And so at the same time it feels like there's not much happening, but the other time you're paying a bunch because all these costs are coming in. And so people I find tend to want things to move on to the next phase as quickly as possible here, but there's a defined duration that we have to deal with. And we always want to get one coat of primer on at the very least once drywall is done and we kind of begin the rest of our work. The finish coats, sometimes we'll do a finish coat and then wait for a second, or sometimes we'll just do a prime and then do first and second coats after more work has been complete. It entirely depends on the needs of the project.
And time code is important because it's a part of the actual building envelope in case anybody's
That's right.
wondering. Like it's actually a part of making sure that your home's building envelope is complete. It's that last kind of like layer on the inside of the house that kind of, keeps the inside of your wall nice and dry and keeps the moisture all where it's supposed to be.
Yep.
So it is important. And then, like I was saying, it's not uncommon for us to not necessarily do all of the finish painting all at the same time. Sometimes it's just like impractical because you want to be able to do your touch ups and whatnot at the end.
That's right.
But also a lot of homeowners aren't necessarily sure what they want their finished like wall color to be until they see everything in the space in the light. Like they've seen selections, they've seen samples of what the cabinetry color and everything is going to look like. But when you see it in the actual space with the actual light fixtures, with the natural light from outside where your home location is, it's not uncommon for that to be kind of kicked down the road a little bit.
And it's also the most affordable time to do your prime coat because you can just do it really quickly right after drywall before there's anything in the house.
All the space.
That's right.
And then we start moving into interior finishes. And this is where, again, people start to get, in my experience, really excited because they start seeing their finishes showing up and going in. So they start seeing their flooring going in and their tile going in, which are typically two separate trades just because we like to make sure that our tilers are very good at what they do. They tend to be in very high use, high traffic areas. Um, and so we want to make sure that all the waterproofing is done correctly and that it's going to last really well. And then we also start seeing like our other specialties starting to show up. So you'll see,
Mhm.
a millwork measure happen, and cabinetry will start to show up. And then you'll also see after the cabinetry has shown up and been installed, you'll see a countertop measure. And people often wonder, like, why can't we just get all of this stuff coming in at the same time?
Yeah.
But it's really important to do those things as they come in to make sure they're really precise, right, Henry?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what I've learned is that you can stack a lot of these things up and have it go very, very fast, but you have to be willing to accept things being a little off and being a little bit incorrect because you're dealing with assumptions around how something is going to be built and not measuring based off of the as-built thing. And so this phase has some built-in lag time that we essentially, because most of the things you're doing when building a custom home are kind of bespoke or made to measure. And so, for example, the millwork, we could call a millwork company, tell them to make us some boxes, and then hope for the best and have some fillers and make some adjustments on site. But most of our clients want to see something that is like tailored to their space. And for us to do that correctly, we need to build the space and then have the cabinet company come and measure it and then start their fabrication. And the same thing goes for counters, stairs, and a number of like kind of our trim pieces and custom glass pieces, mirrors, and et cetera, kind of that cover the whole space and kind of what makes a home really kind of stand out and shine. The same thing goes for good tile, like Megan already touched on good tile work, but the if you start looking out for bad tile work, especially in commercial spaces, you'll start to appreciate the cost of good tile work in your home. At least that's my opinion. I've seen some ugly stuff that I would feel miserable looking at every day, and I want to make sure that we can deliver that like a high level of quality for all of our clients. And so tile takes its own amount of time. And this interior finishes phase essentially is where the most variation in schedule can be found in a project. Like a lot of what we've come up against before this is kind of prescribed based on just how long something takes. However, some floors take a little longer to install than others, like a floating floor versus a glue down floor or any kind of custom patterns. Like a herringbone floor will take much, much longer. It could take like a month to install, whereas a straight run of hardwood floor can be done in less than a week. And so those are the decisions that you want to think about when you're planning your project, not only just how much does it cost, but how long will it take for the project overall.
We also see things like, in a new home, people think, we don't have to worry too much about existing conditions, but that's not always true because it still depends on how flat like the floor sheathing is, or if
Mhm.
something has kind of there's been some sort of hiccup throughout the course of construction, or if there's some sort of site condition that just kind of adds a little bit of
Yeah.
complexity. Like you were talking about the peat bogs and something like that. If you're building in that kind of area, then
Mhm.
a home construction takes over a year to do that, and you're going to see shifting in the home even in that short period of time.
Oh yeah, and sometimes even in ways that you won't expect. Like early in my career, I think we were doing a project and we went to lunch and then came back and all the doors were out of line. And it's because there
Yeah.
was a small earthquake and we hadn't braced everything yet. And so we then had to straighten everything out a little bit after, like you say. But things and we were just lucky we got it. Um, but yeah, there's a number of like hoops to jump throughout all of this, and you have to do manage the site conditions. You have to manage, even like you say, even if the humidity isn't right in a home, then you need to kind of make sure it is right before you install certain products. I'm going to avoid going in the weeds, but that is like the conditions impact the quality and impact the schedule.
And it all doesn't just affect like the finished look of something. Like we all want our homes to look really nice too, but something that I've really learned that is incredibly important is also like the longevity of the product as well. It's one thing if it looks nice at the end of construction and everything, but does it look nice and perform well for a long period of time? Like I know that you and I
Yes.
have both gone into homes where we walk around and we're like, ooh, that did not age so well.
Yeah. The joke in the industry is it looks good from afar, but it's far from good. Anyways.
Yeah. And then once we kind of get to the point where, the interior finishes are largely done and ready to go, we start getting into our exterior finishes. And so this is where we kind of see some of our finishing touches on the exterior, where you might see like the exterior lights going up, or the house numbers going on. But this is also where you'll see a lot of your hardscaping and landscaping finishing, where we try to get these things done in the most timely manner possible, but also like some of these things really do need to wait till closer to the end of construction to make sure that they don't get damaged. Or if one of the services or something needs to be, for whatever reason, covered for the city, like Henry said earlier,
Yeah.
sometimes they're just a smidge behind. And then also just, making sure that you have all of your hardscaping and landscaping that the city might require for different living spaces. If you have a rental or a laneway
Mhm.
property, you might be required to put in some trees to create those separate spaces and fencing and whatnot. Um, I know this particular project was very complex to organize for the company because it was on a very steep property. I
Mhm.
remember hearing a lot about it. I wasn't directly involved.
Yeah. Well, you should count yourself thankful. Yeah, the property finishing on this project specifically was extensive. As you can see, there's a fairly terraced kind of like set of retaining walls and planters. And that was done really specifically to manage the needs of like specific railings and guards along the slope. And there's only front access to this property, and the house is already up on a hill. And if you can look, even just looking at this driveway, you can tell it's fairly steep. And so we agonized, like literally agonized about making sure that the client's car would fit into this driveway because the grade was so tight. We had to get a special relaxation from the city, just because there was no way of making this a driveway work that was compliant on this property. And and like that was just the driveway. But this is where a lot of schedule can be kind of stretched as well in a project. And that can be done for financing reasons. I was speaking with another contractor earlier this week, and one of the things that they were talking about was that they're essentially not completing certain parts of the exterior of a home, like in terms of the property finishing, so their client can trigger the completion of their construction financing, and then they can kind of use some extra funds that will happen when that lending is complete to finish the exterior of the house. And so sometimes there's strategic decisions that impact your schedule as well, in terms of managing your own cash flow. Like if your lending is set up in a way that allows for you to kind of charge like fully ahead, then that's something that you're able to do, and that's fantastic and will save you money over time. However, sometimes it's important to be strategic. Sometimes you want to make sure you complete a certain amount of work, or you don't want to build your fence until you and your neighbor are cool again, for example, because you want to split that cost. There's a number of considerations when you're going into the finishing stage.
And the key thing for all of that when you're dealing with strategic aspects is to communicate that with your team members, with your
That's right.
contractor, your designer, whomever, so that everyone's on the same page. And that's the quick and dirty of it. That's a snapshot of it. So going through again, just kind of like reviewing everything. And so this picture in the background is very similar to the one that we looked at before, except it actually shows a lot more of the construction schedule that we just talked about. So I mean, most new homes that we've been looking at, I mean, it's quite a range, but it takes a little bit more than a year at minimum with all of the
Mhm.
requirements and everything, right, Henry? Where
Yeah, the
we're
fastest I think we've ever built a house, which was in like not ever, but like in the last few years, was I think 11 months. And that was a relatively simply designed home, so that we were able to save some time there. But what's much more common is to say get to like you're kind of suggesting to get to like just over a year for the major part of the project, and then have it extend a bit beyond for completion of the property finishing. And for like a more complicated home, like we're building a net zero project right now, and that is likely to be about 16 months roughly. Like just over just over a year and a bit. But that's also just because there's some pretty custom finishing that we know is going to extend the project as well. I know some builders who are building strictly for speed and for cost. They've turned over a house in less than 6 months, but I don't know if it's the house I'd want to live in. But it is possible to complete a single family home relatively quickly if you're able to kind of like basically toss your builder and designer the keys to make some decisions for you. That may not be that may not match your design taste, but will get you um, closer to say a time target that you may have.
Yeah. I mean, in our experience, the key to having like a smooth execution of a custom home is just making sure that everything's planned for properly, ordered for
Yeah.
properly, and that's that's what we do. That's the role that we play. We make sure that
Yeah.
everything is designed to our homeowners' specifications and what they're wanting out of their dream home, and then making sure that we have all the information so that we can execute it in said timely manner. So it's not dragging on, 2, 3, 4 years,
Yeah.
which I have heard of on occasion.
That's right. And we want to make sure that and the way to do that, Megan, is to make sure all of the key like the professionals in the project are working together. So you want to have your like creative design matching up with your technical detailing, like your structural engineer, your envelope, your energy modeling to connect with your construction team, and kind of having all collaboratively working together to figure out what is the best version of the project. And that takes a bunch of work up front, takes some investment on the part of the homeowner to kind of like put some dollars and some time into figuring out all those key details, but they do pay off in dividends later in terms of being able to compress your construction schedule and overall reduce your end construction cost.
Yeah, having everyone sit at the same table for sure. So that brings us to our Q&A section, where Michelle helps us monitor the chat, and also if anybody has any questions to like raise their hand, and we will happily answer your questions.
All right. So I do have one question here. And the question is, how many times do we have fire inspections? And what do they check?
So there isn't usually a specific fire inspection as part of a custom home build. Usually what you'll see is that there's fireproofing requirements as part of the project that are like the city that you have to include in your project documentation. So you have to put in that your drywall has a certain fire rating, your roof has a certain fire rating, your shear walls, and any spaces separating demising suites. And then you have to have your sprinkler system and your interconnected smoke detectors. And those are covered through usually your framing inspection, your insulation inspection, your sprinkler inspection, and your electrical inspections. And so the whole building code itself is based around safety of the homeowner. And so, or the resident and occupant is a better way of putting it. And so the coverage for fire safety tends to happen on an ongoing basis through the approval of the project.
And then we have
Yeah,
another.
it's one.
Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, yeah, like it intersects in places where we'll see, like, you want to make sure that there's egress, and that the building materials lead up to your 1 or 2 hour fire separations, depending on what your requirement is, and all of
Mhm.
those things.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then we have another question here. So it says, thank you for the informative session. It is a little bit of a different question, but what is the pricing difference between a multifamily and a single family home in as far as per square footage?
I'm going to assume that's not necessarily assuming we're talking about like a multiplex project and not like a multifamily development, because I we are not specialists in kind of putting together 30, 40, 60 unit project developments. I have some colleagues and friends who do, and I can follow up with them on that maybe. Uh, but I would say the answer to everything on this question is it depends. If you assume the same level of finish across and level of feature in every space, then your cost per foot will probably increase by 20 or 30% because you're adding, like, for every unit, you're adding a kitchen, two bathrooms, and a laundry, as well as a heating, cooling system, and a number of other features. And that multiplies for every single dwelling unit. And now, if you're building for rental versus building a custom home, then it's an entirely different conversation. I'll give you my personal opinion that the dollars per square foot is a horrible metric to evaluate a project and a contractor, because it's not actually representative of what the product you're getting. It's essentially what's the cheapest, worst thing you can afford. And that's not a good way of making a decision based on what your home should be. Uh, I don't think people make decisions like that on any other part of your life. Like, you don't decide, like, how much is my dinner cost by the ounce. You buy your dinner based on the dinner you want. And the same thing goes, like, another mentor of me asked me, like, do people buy cars by the pound, Henry? And a Porsche and a Civic weigh about the same, but they are not the same. And so when someone's building you a house they're telling you it's 200 something bucks a foot, and then someone else tells you it's 700 bucks a foot, one house is a hell of a lot better than the other. And I think it comes down to where your priorities and values lie in terms of how do you put that on there. I think it comes down to there's other variables that I'd recommend reviewing before you look at like just the raw cost per foot.
Yeah, I know we come down to like the what's included aspect of that all the time. Like what is your scope of work? What have they provided? We really like to dive into the nitty-gritty of all of that.
Mhm. And I have two more questions here. They thank us for the detailed presentation as it's been really helpful. The question here is, what all stages include intervention input from an architect during the process of construction, and how does that coordination work?
That's a that entirely depends on the project and the client. So if a home is, I believe, less than 6,500 square feet, an architect is not required for a project. And so if you're building something larger than that, you enter into part 3 of the building code where architects are required, in which you would have architects signed off on certificates of completion at different stages of the work, and they become the coordinating professional. However, for our typical scale of construction, we do not always have an architect on the home. Sometimes it is done by a home designer, sometimes it's done by our own internal team, and other times it's done by an architect. Uh, but the overall supervision of the architect is a service that's borne by the client. And that's typically, my understanding is that's typically a percentage of the total construction cost, and it can get quite expensive. And good architects don't always want to do supervisory work and the administration that goes with it.
And so if I heard the question correctly, I heard something about intervention in there. And so to me, that means like how many interactions do we typically see from an architect through the course of construction to potentially change things or correct things? And I would say in our experience, it's very, very little because of how we
Yeah.
go about planning our projects and making sure that everything is planned
Yeah.
according to, again, the homeowner, the end users, specifications, and everybody's on the same page. And we also, we cherry pick the professionals that we work with. We work with people who um, enjoy working as a team and want to, solve problems together and work in the best interests of the client. Um, so I would say we personally don't see a lot of that, like in the middle of construction intervention of changing plans or being like, no, that's not good enough because everybody's on the same page and working towards the same
Yeah.
end goal.
My experience with architects is once they're done their design and signed off on their drawings, they usually toss us the keys and leave us alone.
Right.
I've got a couple questions direct message to me. Is there anyone else in the chat that you want to hit, Michelle, before I kind of answer those?
Sure. I have which city has the fastest turnover from tear down to final occupancy?
Uh, that is, I'm actually not certain. Um, I think Burnaby's pretty quick right now. I've also like their permitting process has been streamlined and made pretty simple. Um, the there's no difference in how from city to city on when you get your permit to when you get your occupancy. That's entirely based on your builder and your plan and the ability to complete it. But in terms of permit turnarounds, I'd say Burnaby's really good. I've also heard some good things sometimes about Abbotsford if you're actually doing a very simple project. It sounds like if like you aren't doing anything complicated, they actually turned it around pretty fast. But if it's complicated, then they can get difficult because they're not as well educated on building science there. But it depends on your project. Like almost every question I get, I'm sorry, I have to say it depends because a lot of it does.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And then I have another question here about what charts and schedules do you give clients access to?
We typically will produce like a full project schedule that kind of outlines what the work will be, and then we'll update it like when we hit major milestones in the project. And that is entirely like based on when we know we need to update the schedule. Sometimes your schedule stays tight and you kind of just follow along. And every once in a while you hit a major milestone. You're like, ooh, we hit a delay. We need to extend something. We know a product is now on a longer back order. And so we have to kick that out. But we usually do it on an ongoing basis. And we also provide kind of daily reports. And so this slide's a great example. Thanks for switching it over here. Is if you were to rotate it 90 degrees, it kind of happens in the span of time. And so you see this is a very detailed custom home schedule that itemizes every task in the home over a period of about a year and a bit. And then our clients have access to this, and they also receive daily field reports and have access to the live schedule that we're working off of.
We also provide like additional documentation to our clients to kind of help them plan with their like cash flow and stuff like that. This is something that people have become like because they want to be able to, plan to make sure that they can pay their bills on time and everything. So
Mhm.
we also, alongside with stuff like this, we provide other charts and cash flow documents so that people can stay up to date with what's going on in their project and the flow of it all and be prepared.
That's right.
Mhm. And then there's a few more questions, not super related, but just throw it out here. It says, during a reno, how do you account financially when you get into the weeds? And there's another one saying, how do you structure trade payments? Are there
Okay.
milestones?
Yeah, so I can answer both of those pretty quickly. Look, most trades are done on a milestone basis, based on their specific contract. So every company has a slightly different contract and payment schedule, I find. But usually, like for example, our plumber usually invoices us around 30% of their agreement on completion of the rough-in. No, sorry, on the beginning of their work, and then another 30% on completion of the rough-in, and then the balance on completion of the project. Uh, and it changes based on the contractor. Some contractors just don't, we just tell them to show up and start working, and they don't bill us until they're done. It depends on our relationship. It depends on their business setup. Uh, the question about how do you account financially when you get into the weeds, and I'll give a bit of a facetious answer, and that is that you don't get in the weeds because you're always accounting for it financially. And so we are tracking our costs every single week, every single hour gets allocated to a cost code. Major purchases all have purchase orders. Subcontractors are selected ahead of time. And so if things get squirrely, it's because someone isn't doing their job, and then they have to start doing their job to make things right. Uh, but that's how we do it. Is you do it by financially accounting, tracking everything throughout the entire course of the project.
Okay, those are all the questions on my end here.
Okay, no,
Perfect.
that actually mirrors some of the ones I was direct messaged as well. So I think that covers all of our known questions.
Mhm.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all of the. We love all the interaction. We love all the questions at the end of the webinars. They're
For
they're
sure.
honestly my favorite part.
Yeah.
Um, our next webinar is May 28th, and we're going to restart the series. So we'll head right back to webinar number one. So if you missed that, please feel free to attend. And if you have any more questions kind of down the line, Michelle's really great about sending a thank you email to everyone who attended. And if you'd like to set up like a separate product consultation, Henry and I take meetings all the time, and we'd love to chat with you about it. Yeah,
Would love
we
to
look
talk
forward
about
to
your
seeing you guys next
project.
month. Yeah,
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
thanks
everyone.
everyone. Good night.
Bye.